Okay, let's dive deep into a really fascinating question today. We've got a new stack of sources centered on one particular academic study. What if, and this is pretty intriguing, what if one specific type of activity could actually, well, maybe turn back your body's biological clock
Right.
at the cellular level by years? That's the kind of the big idea we're digging into.
Exactly. And, the core concept here involves something called telomeres. We need to unpack the science behind these. Think of them basically as protective caps on the very ends of our chromosomes, the things that hold our DNA. And their length turns out to be a really important marker for how our cells are aging. It's even linked, studies show, to our risk for certain diseases.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to really understand what this pretty large study found, specifically about the connection between strength training, so lifting weights, resistance work, and these crucial indicators of biological age. We'll look at the data, what they found, and importantly, what it might actually mean for you.
So let's start with telomeres. Imagine the little plastic tips on the ends of your shoelaces, the ones that stop them fraying. Telomeres are kind of like that, but for our chromosomes. They're these stretches of DNA and protein right at the tips. And their main job is providing stability. They shield the important genetic code on the chromosome itself. Now, the thing is, every single time one of our cells divides, and this is happening constantly, right, throughout life, those telomeres get just a tiny bit shorter. It's just part of the process. A portion of that telomere DNA doesn't get fully copied. And this shortening, well, it contributes directly to cellular aging. As they get shorter, cells can eventually stop dividing properly. They enter this state called a senescence, which is, linked to age-related decline. So telomere length is really strongly tied to chronological age. Older we get, typically the shorter they become. It's a key marker of biological or cellular aging. And, this isn't just some microscopic detail without real-world consequences. Shorter telomeres are really strongly linked to a higher risk of getting diseases prematurely and even earlier death. There's research, like studies following people for years, showing that individuals with shorter telomeres have a significantly higher risk of all-cause mortality compared to those with longer ones. So keeping them long seems pretty important for health span.
Wow, okay. So they really are like a biological clock ticking away inside our cells. That's quite something. Which brings us neatly to the study we're focusing on today. It's pretty recent, published this year, 2024, in the journal Biology.
Hmm.
Authors are Tucker and Bates. And their specific aim, right, was to look at the connection, the association between the amount of time people spend strength training each week and the length of these telomeres. And they did this using a really large sample of people from across the U.S. designed to represent the general population.
That's exactly right. They tapped into data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NADNS for short. It's a major ongoing study, really well respected, designed to be representative of the whole U.S. civilian population. The specific data they used for this analysis was collected between 1999 and 2002.
Okay. And who was in the study? How many people?
The sample size was pretty substantial, 4,814 U.S. adults. They're aged between 20 and 69 years old. And yeah, it was a diverse group selected using a pretty rigorous multi-stage sampling strategy to make sure it reflected the U.S. population at that time.
Okay, right. Now, the tricky part, maybe, how did they actually measure these things? Telomere length sounds, well, complicated to measure accurately.
It is precise work, definitely. But they used established and validated methods. Telomere length was measured from blood samples. They used a technique called quantitative PCR, and it was processed by a very reputable lab, the Blackburn Laboratory, actually, which is, a leading name in telomere research. The paper describes a pretty rigorous process of multiple assays, controls, checks to ensure accuracy. The average telomere length in their sample, for context, was about 1,590 base pair.
Okay, so reliable measurement on the telomere side. What about the strength training? How did they figure that out?
That was based on self-report. Participants were asked about various physical activities they had done over the previous 30 days, and that included specific questions about weightlifting or strength training. So the researchers took the time people reported spending on strength training per week, and they analyzed it in a couple of ways. They grouped people into categories like less than 10 minutes a week, which was basically none, 10 to 50 minutes a week, and 60 minutes or more per week. And they also looked at it just as a continuous number total minutes per week.
And you mentioned most people weren't doing much.
Yeah, that's a key point. The vast majority, over 93% of the sample, reported doing less than 10 minutes of strength training per week.
Wow. So finding any effect in those smaller groups who are lifting is pretty significant then.
Exactly. And crucially, to try and isolate the effect of the strength training itself, they had to account for other things that might influence telomere length, right? These are called covariates. So they use statistical methods to control for the usual suspects: age, sex, race, and ethnicity, income, household size. Also, smoking history, they measured it in pack years body mass index, or BMI, and importantly, the amount of other physical activity people were doing, like cardio, measured in minutes. The whole point of controlling for these was to see if strength training had a connection to telomere length above and beyond all these other factors.
Got it. Okay, so controlling for all that.
Yeah.
This is the moment we've been building up to. What did they actually find? Did strength training link up with longer telomeres?
Yes, that was the clear takeaway. Regular strength training was significantly associated with longer telomere.
Okay.
When they compared the different groups, the 10-min, 10, 50-minute, 60-minute groups, they saw significant differences, even after adjusting just for demographic factors like age, sex, race. The results were significant. Specifically, those training 60 minutes or more per week had significantly longer telomeres compared to the group doing less than 10 minutes. And the 10 to 50-minute group also had significantly longer telomeres than the non-trainers.
Okay, can we put some numbers on that difference?
Oh.
How much longer?
Yeah, so after adjusting for those demographics, the 60-plus minute group had telomeres that were, on average, about 238 base pairs longer than the non-trainers. And the 10 to 50-minute group, theirs were about 140 base pairs longer.
That seems like quite a difference.
It is. And importantly, even after they adjusted for everything demographics plus lifestyle factors like smoking, BMI, and even the other physical activity, the differences remain statistically significant. With all those adjustments, the 60-plus minute group still had telomeres about 225 base pairs longer than the non-trainers, and the 10 to 50-minute groups were about 123 base pairs longer.
Wow. Okay, so the link holds up even when you account for other healthy behaviors.
Hmm.
That's strong. And you said they also looked at it continuously, like minute by minute.
Exactly. That was the other analysis, looking at total minutes per week, and they found a clear linear relationship. Basically, the more minutes per week someone spent strength training, the longer their telomeres tended to be, on average. After controlling for all those covariates we mentioned, they calculated that for every additional 10 minutes of weekly strength training, mean telomere length was associated with being 6.7 base pairs longer.
Okay, 6.7 base pairs longer for every 10 minutes. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, connecting it back to biological age, right?
Yeah.
How do we translate those base pairs into something like years?
Right. This is probably the most striking translation of the findings.
Hmm.
The researchers also looked at how much telomeres shortened with chronological age within the same group of people, and they found that, on average, each year older a person was, their telomeres were about 15.5 base pairs shorter. That was the average rate of age-related shortening in this sample.
Okay, 15.5 base pairs shorter per year of age.
So now we can kind of put those two numbers together. Let's take someone doing, say, 90 minutes of strength training per week. That's 9 increments of 10 minutes, right?
Makes sense, yeah.
So based on the finding, that level of training would be associated with telomeres that are about 9 times 6.7 base pairs longer, which comes out to roughly 60.3 base pairs longer on average.
Okay, 60.3 base pairs longer for doing 90 minutes a week.
Now compare that to the effect of aging. If 1 year of aging costs you about 15.5 base pairs, then having an extra 60.3 base pairs is like offsetting. Well, you divide 60.3 by 15.5, and that comes out to approximately 3.9 years.
Wow.
So the finding, when you translate it like that, is pretty powerful. Doing about 90 minutes of strength training per week was associated with having telomeres characteristic of someone approximately 3.9 years biologically younger compared to someone doing essentially no strength training. And that's after accounting for age, sex, race, income, smoking, BMI, and other physical activity.
That is. Yeah, that's profound. Nearly 4 years younger at the cellular level, associated with just an hour and a half of lifting a week.
The paper even mentioned that if you looked at 180 minutes a week, the association was equivalent to about 7.8 years less biological aging.
Incredible. Okay, so what's the thinking here? Why might strength training have this kind of effect on our telomeres? What are the potential mechanisms?
Well, the researchers discussed this in the paper. We already know that general lifestyle factors, things like obesity, exercise overall, diet, they've all been linked to telomere health and the aging process. Strength training specifically brings a number of benefits that could be playing a role here. For instance, it's really effective at reversing age-related muscle loss, sarcopenia. It also increases your resting metabolic rate, helps reduce body fat, especially the dangerous visceral fat around the organs, and it improves cardiovascular health markers like lowering blood pressure, improving cholesterol profile.
Right, those are all well-known benefits.
Exactly, and these benefits directly combat many of the chronic diseases and metabolic problems that accelerate aging, things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease. So the connection to telomeres. Well, these chronic conditions are often driven by or associated with higher levels of chronic inflammation and oxidative stress in the body. And both inflammation and oxidative stress are known to be kind of bad news for telomeres. They can damage DNA and seem to accelerate telomere shortening. So the theory is that by improving metabolic health, reducing fat, lowering inflammation, and maybe even directly reducing oxidative stress, strength training creates a more protective cellular environment for telomeres.
Ah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's tackling the underlying factors that might otherwise cause telomeres to shorten faster. It's not just magic, it's physiology.
Precisely. It's influencing the underlying biological processes.
Did the study find anything else interesting related to telomere length, apart from the strength training connection?
Oh, yeah. They looked at the relationships with all those covariates they controlled for. As you'd absolutely expect, chronological age was very strongly linked. Older people had shorter telomeres. No surprise there. They also found significant associations with race and ethnicity, household size. BMI people classified as obese generally had shorter telomeres than those in the normal weight range, and smoking history measured in pack years. More smoking history meant shorter telomeres, again, mostly fitting with other research.
Okay, so those factors matter too.
Yes. But here's a really interesting, almost surprising, finding that actually makes the strength training result stand out even more. Remember, they controlled for other physical activity, measured in meet minutes, basically capturing things like walking, running, cycling, general activity levels.
Yeah.
Well, in their final models, once they accounted for strength training and everything else, the total amount of that other physical activity was not significantly predictive of telomere length.
Oh, really? So just being generally active, doing cardio or walking, didn't show the same link in this particular study?
Not in this analysis, no. Once strength training was in the model, the effect of other meet minutes wasn't statistically significant. It really points towards something potentially specific about the strength training component in relation to telomere length, at least in this data set.
Huh. That is interesting. It wasn't just overall activity, but the resistance training itself seemed to be the key factor
That's
to it.
what these results suggest, yeah.
Okay. Now, we should always do this, look at the study's context. What about limitations
Mm,
and strengths?
right, very important. The authors are quite clear about the limitations. First, big one. It's a cross-sectional study. It's just a snapshot in time. So while they found this strong link, this association between strength training and longer telomeres, they can't definitively prove that the strength training caused the longer telomeres.
Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. It's theoretically possible that people with genetically longer telomeres are just more likely to take up strength training, although that seems maybe less plausible. But you can't rule it out from this design. Another limitation is the reliance on self-reported physical activity. People aren't always perfectly accurate recalling how much they exercise.
Yeah, remembering the exact minutes over 30 days can be tough.
Right. And they only asked about the last 30 days. That doesn't capture long-term habitual strength training patterns, which might be even more relevant for something like telomere length. And of course, there could always be other unmeasured factors, other lifestyle things that might be influencing the results.
Okay, so those are the caveats. What about the strengths? What makes this study compelling despite the limitations?
It definitely has major strengths. First, as we mentioned, the telomere length measurement itself was done using, state-of-the-art methods in a highly respected lab. That gives confidence in that data. Second, they statistically controlled for a really wide range of potential confounding variables: age, sex, race, BMI, smoking, income, and other types of exercise. That really helps strengthen the case that the strength training link might be independent. Also, the fact that telomere length did strongly correlate with age in their sample provides a kind of internal validation it behaved as expected biologically. And maybe the biggest strength, the sample itself. It was large, it was randomly selected, it was diverse, and it was designed to be representative of the entire U.S. adult population within that age range. That means the findings are likely quite generalizable, at least to the U.S. population back then.
Okay, great. So let's try and distill this down. Bringing it all together, what are the key takeaways you think we should leave our listeners with from this deep dive?
Well, first, clearly, telomeres are important. They're these key markers of how our cells are aging, and keeping them longer seems to be linked to better health outcomes and lower disease risk.
Absolutely. And second, this large, well-conducted study provides pretty compelling evidence for a significant link between doing regular strength training and having longer telomeres.
And maybe the most headline-grabbing part is that quantified estimate suggesting that doing something achievable, like 90 minutes of strength training a week, was associated with a biological age difference, based on telomeres, of roughly 4 years. And that held up even after accounting for a lot of other lifestyle factors.
Right. And don't forget that somewhat surprising finding that, in this study at least, other types of physical activity didn't show that same significant link once strength training was considered. It really highlights the potential unique role of resistance exercise here. It really is quite incredible, isn't it? To think that an activity like lifting weights, something we can actively choose to do, might actually influence this fundamental process of aging right down at the cellular level.
It is. It's a very provocative finding. And, thinking about the limitations, again, specifically that they only measured strength training over the last 30 days, it does leave you with a final thought to chew on, doesn't it? If just 30 days of reported activity shows this kind of association, what might the cumulative impact be? What could consistent strength training practiced over many years or even decades mean for our cellular aging and maybe our overall health span? Something to think about.